Hi, I am Kimmy with On William Street, and this week we are doing a series especially for kids on how to make a quilt top. So what we've done so far is on Monday we talked about how to pick out fabrics and the different ways to look at fabrics and the colors and things that you can choose. Yesterday we went ahead and we cut everything out, and what we needed is we need 5-inch squares, and we have 108 of them for our quilt top. And today we're going to start sewing those squares together. So grab your stack of squares and let's get started. So when sewing a quilt top together, whatever sewing machine you have isn't really going to be that big of a deal. You're going to just use a straight stitch. So if you have a real nice basic sewing machine, that will work. If you have a super fancy sewing machine, that will work as well. Whatever sewing machine that you have, make sure that you get your adult, a responsible adult, to show you how to use it. Most sewing machines are very, very simple. You're just going to have a foot that's going to guide the fabric through, and you're going to have a foot pedal to press to start the machine. But make sure that you get help if this is your very first time sewing. Have your adult show you how to use it. Then as you get used to it, you can go ahead and finish the quilt top out. All right, so go ahead and grab your fabrics. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sort them out into the different piles, because what we're going to is, because we have 9 different fabrics, each square is going to be made up of 9 different squares, and what's going to be called a 9 patch. Super creative, I know. 9 squares becomes a 9 patch. So we're just going to make one from each fabric, and we're going to make 12 different blocks. The order that you sew these together in actually does not matter so much. So you can kind of mix and match, kind of however you want to go. So what we're going to do to get started is I'm just going to grab 2 squares, sew them together, then I'm going to add a 3rd one and set that row aside. Then I'm going to make my 2nd row, and I'm going to make my 3rd row, and then we'll go ahead and iron them and put them together. So like I said, it doesn't really matter the order that you do it in. You can pick randomly. We're just going to put 1 of each print per block, and we'll have 12 blocks by the time that we are finished. So to sew these together, like I said, definitely get your adult to help you, show you how to use the sewing machine and get comfortable with it. So what we're going to do is we're going to be sewing a 1/4 inch seam, and that's going to be a pretty standard seam for all quilts. Most blocks are going to go together with a 1/4 inch seam. And if you see on the side of my sewing machine, I have this one here marked a 1/4 inch. I also have this fancy foot, so I know that the edge of the foot is also a 1/4 inch, but if you don't have that, that's totally fine. Just make sure that you're using your line here, and you're going to take your 2 fabrics and you're going to line them right up. If you want to, you can also stick a couple pins in. These are smaller and will hold together pretty well, but it might be worthwhile to go ahead and stick 1 pin on each side. Just remember that when you're using pins, you don't want to sew over the top of them. With this, if you're using a print, you'll notice that the prints are going to look different. You're going to have this side that's kind of faded and this side that's nice and bright. This is the right side of the fabric. With the solid, it usually isn't an issue. It doesn't matter what side, but you want to make sure that when you're doing this, the right sides go together so that the wrong side or the faded side is pointing up. That way when you sew them together, your seams are going to be on the right side and your fabric's going to be on the right side. So I've got my couple of pins in here, and you can just start sewing. With quilting, you don't need to worry about anything else, just start sewing. But before you sew over that pin, make sure to take it out and move it out of the way. And then go nice and slow, especially if you're new. If you've been sewing for a while, you can probably go a little bit faster. But if this is one of your first sewing projects, just take it nice and slow. We aren't in a hurry. It's totally okay if you don't get this done in one day. You can take a couple days and come back. The videos aren't going anywhere. So now that I have this seam all sewn together, I'm going to open it up, grab another fabric, and I'm going to line it up on this side. So you see the right side is pointing up. That's the right side. This is a solid, so it doesn't matter. And I'm just going to do the same thing. Line it up so it matches right along that edge. Take my 2 pins, put 1 pin here, and 1 pin on this side. And I'm going in a little bit from the edge, so that will allow me to get started sewing just a little bit before I have to take that pin out. So right along your 1/4 inch seam, take your pin out, and then sew all the way down the side. Stop before you go over that pin, take it out, and go to the edge. If you're wondering why you want to make sure to take those pins out before you sew over the top of them, if your needle hits it, you can break your needle or your pin, and we don't want to do that. We want to avoid that. Now that I have these 3 sewn together, I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to do 3 more. So grab 2 more different colors, different prints, and just repeat. And we're going to make 3 rows of this. for one block. All right, now we are ready to iron these. This is one other area that we have to stop and have a safety talk. The iron is very, very hot. Do not use this without an adult supervising. If you are a little bit younger, definitely let the adult do the ironing part. We do not want anybody to get burned with the iron, and also definitely don't leave the iron on when you're done. Make sure that when you're done with your project, it gets turned off. So what we're going to do to iron, we're going to turn it over, and you don't need to worry about pressing your seams open. So if you've sewn before, you've made clothes or something, a lot of times you'll press the seam open. Don't worry about that. We're actually going to just take our iron and we're just going to press it right on top of that seam and push all of them to one direction. Then we're going to come over to this side, do the same thing, press all of them to one direction. If you have some fabric that's a little bit wrinkled, now is also a great time to kind of smooth that out a little bit. After those are done, move them off to the side, turn your next one over, and we're just going to do the same thing. But I'm going to press them to the opposite direction this time. This may or may not matter. Sometimes you might end up with them all going one way, depending on how you decide to lay out your blocks, but that's fine. So those are going that way, and then this one the same thing. We're just going to press them all to one direction. When you're pressing them, you just want to put it on top of that seam. Don't need to worry about moving it around. It should fit under your iron. Count to like 5 or 6 or 7 seams, and then move on. It's not going to take a long time. You want to make sure that they're nice and flat, and then you can see now how nicely each of our blocks lay. And now we can sew all of them together and have our first big block ready to go. So at this point, you're going to want to decide what order you want your blocks in. It's not going to really matter all that much with this quilt design. That's why it's such a great beginner quilt, because we're going to cut it up and move them all around anyway. So you can just kind of pick and choose and decide, oh, I like the way that this looks the best, and go with it. So I'm going to go ahead and sew them like this, and then just grab your first two, set this one out of the way. And where we want to pin it on this one is where those seams match up. So I'm going to lay them right on top of one another so that when we sew it together, that corner comes together really nice. And I'm going to put a pin right where I lined those up. And then on this side, I'm going to do the same thing. Kind of look at them close, put them right on top of one another, and then put a pin right inside that seam. You're going to go back to the sewing machine. You can also, if you want to grab a couple extra pins, you can put a pin at the beginning and at the end as well. If you feel more comfortable with extra pins, they're going to hold your fabric in place so that everything stays where it's supposed to. And then we're going to go back to the sewing machine, and we're just going to do the same thing. Sew a 1/4 inch seam all the way along there. When you get to your seams, make sure that they stay flat. So I like to put my finger on top of those, and that's going to help them stay flat up underneath. Make sure we take our pin out and go. Then keep going all the way down along to the next side. Going nice and slow if you need to make sure that you're keeping that 1/4 inch seam. That's going to be the best way to keep everything the size and shape that it needs to be, is by following that 1/4 inch seam, keeping your fabric just lined up right next to that line on your sewing machine, that mark on your machine. All right, so that is done. And now we're ready to add the next piece, and we're just going to do the same thing. Put it here, take our 2 seams, we're going to put them right next to each other and put a pin. And then over here, we're going to take these 2 seams, put them right next to each other, and we're going to pin. Then, so make sure that the fabrics are lined up, that they don't shift around. Put it underneath your sewing machine and sew a 1/4 inch seam. Don't forget to take those pins out. It's always better to take them out a little bit early than a little bit late. And keep your fingers, as you're moving your fabric through, away from that needle. So now what we need to do here is we do need to iron it again. We're going to turn it over here, and then just take your iron and you can press these either direction. It doesn't really matter, but make sure that you iron these flat, and then as you can see we have one block all done. So we're going to just repeat. You can make all of your blocks exactly the same, or you can mix them up. So just however you want to do it. And you're going to keep going till you have 12 different blocks. After you get your blocks done together, you should have 12 of these 9-patch blocks. So you can see 9 different squares called a 9-patch. So you're going to have 12 different ones. And like I said, you might have them all be the same if that's what you chose to go with. We went ahead and we sewed ours together all just kind of completely random. I didn't think too much about it. I tried not to think too much about it. Grabbed blocks and sewed them together. So all of my blocks are different. So after you have them all done, tomorrow we are actually going to cut them up, mix them around, and sew them back together again. And it makes a really fun pattern. Like I said, it's going to look complicated, but as you can see, it's actually been really easy to put together, and it was a lot of fun to put together and see how it all comes out. So finish up all of your blocks and come back tomorrow, and we will do the next step and put it all together for you, and we'll see you then. Bye.